So the question now is, how do we deal with this problem of market failure? And in particular, how do we deal with the problem of externalities? Well, one approach to that that was put forward by the father of economics, Adam Smith, a long time ago, was that we should, in this little tome here, if you've got a spare few months, you might like to read through it. Anyway, when he's talking particularly about what today we would classify as public goods, he writes the following. The third and last duty of the sovereign or commonwealth is that of erecting and maintaining those public institutions and those public works which, though they might be in the highest degree advantageous to a great society, are, however, of such a nature that the profit could never repay the expense to any individual or small number of individuals, and which it therefore cannot be expected that any individual or small number of individuals should erect or maintain. So the government would have to pay for those kinds of public goods. And here he's talking about, well, initially he talked about national defence and the judicial system, so courts and police. But then he goes on to talk about the importance of also providing education. And today we would classify, in the case of education, this is an example of market failure because there are positive externalities generated by the consumption of education. Now, this kind of approach to externalities in general was systematized and thought about more carefully by a famous economist of the early 20th century, Arthur Cecil Pigou. And he wrote about it in this little number here, The Economics of Welfare. And if we go to that on page 192, we find that he's expressing the problem of externalities in marginal terms. That is, in terms of the marginal private benefits and the marginal social benefits, or as he calls them, dividends. And he writes here that it is plain that divergences between private and social net product cannot, like the divergences due to tenancy laws, be mitigated by a modification of the contractual relation between any two contracting parties, because the divergence between the private product and the net social product arises out of a service or disservice, something good or something bad, rendered to persons other than the contracting parties, that is, to bystanders, those who are external to the market. And so he says that how are we going to solve this problem if we can't do it simply by modifying a contractual arrangement between buyers and sellers? He says, it is, however, possible for the state, and the state here means the entire governmental apparatus, if it so chooses, to remove the divergence in any field by extraordinary encouragements or extraordinary restraints upon investments in that field. The most obvious forms which these encouragements and restraints may assume are, of course, those of bounties and taxes. Bounties here means subsidies, the government giving money. And taxes obviously means where the government takes money away from the market participants. And he goes on to give a couple of examples. And this book is written in the 1920s, so the examples are, well, maybe they're still applicable somewhat today. But at least one of them is. So he says, the private net product of any unit of investment is unduly large relative to the social net product in the businesses of producing and distributing alcoholic drinks. Consequently, in nearly all countries, special taxes are placed upon these businesses. So the idea is that external costs are being imposed on others because of the production and consumption of alcohol. It harms other members of the society, and therefore governments step in to impose taxes on these particular industries to try and curtail their overproduction and consumption. And he also talks about where there can be external benefits as well. So he says, the private net product of any unit of investment is unduly small in industries such as agriculture, which are supposed to yield the indirect service of developing citizens suitable for military training. Well, this seems a bit odd to us today, but back when Pigou is writing, it seems to have been the idea that people who worked in agriculture, on farms and so on, would develop skills which would be useful for military training. So, for example, my grandfather went off to the Second World War, and before he worked on a dairy farm, and he was made a drill sergeant because, unlike people from the city, he knew how to, 1, ride horses, and 2, fix tractors, and 3, shoot guns. So that made him uniquely suited to being in the army. So the idea was at the time. And that's what Pigou is talking about here. So he says that in that case, the government would provide a bounty or a subsidy to the agricultural sector to encourage greater training of people in agriculture, because it has a side benefit to the society at large by training people for the military. And he goes on to say we could take an even more extreme example of that, and this gets back to Adam Smith's idea of the public good. A more extreme form of bounty, in which the government authority provides all of the funds required, is given upon such services as the planning of towns, police administration, and sometimes the clearing of slum areas. This type of bounty is also, not infrequently, given upon the work of spreading information about improved processes in production in occupations where, owing to the lack of appreciation on the part of potential beneficiaries, it would be difficult to collect a fee for undertaking that task. Alright, so let's look at a more systematic understanding of what Pigou is talking about here. And we can use our graphical tools that we've acquired to do that. Alright, so here we've got our downward sloping demand curve reflecting the marginal private benefits of consumption, and we've got a slightly upward sloping supply curve reflecting the marginal the marginal private costs of production. Now what we want to introduce here is the externalities, the negative externalities of production due to, for example, the pollution generated by the production of this particular product. So here we're going to assume, just for fun, that at low levels of production, the externality generated, the negative externality generated, is relatively small, but as output increases, the externality gets larger, measured in monetary terms. Now, Pigu's idea is that you would impose a tax on the culprit, that is, the producer, as he calls it, the investment, equal to the size of the externality generated. So if a small amount were produced, then a small tax equal to the small externality would be imposed on the sellers. If, on the other hand, a large amount were produced, then a large tax equal to the size of the externality would be imposed on the sellers. The effect of that would be to push upwards the supply curve by the value of the external effect, or in other words, push it up by the value of the tax imposed. So let's draw that in. So we can see here the social supply curve is a supply curve which includes the marginal private costs plus the tax imposed at every level of output. This gives us our marginal social cost curve. And if that tax were imposed, it would be pushing this private supply curve upwards to the social supply curve. Now, if that were to occur, then we would get a new market equilibrium at the point where the marginal benefits equal the marginal social costs, which are now expressed in the market thanks to the imposition of the tax. So we can see that the efficient equilibrium outcome will be the actual market outcome if the tax is imposed. We can see there that this new market equilibrium price, forced by the imposition of the tax, is at a level where the marginal social cost equals the marginal benefit. It's really the marginal social benefit because there's no externality of consumption here. How much will the tax be? Well, the tax is going to be at the optimal output, so the tax is going to be this amount here. So it's 90 cents minus $1.50. So 60 cents per unit is going to be the tax imposed. So 60 cents per unit multiplied by the number of units gives you the total tax area generated. It should be borne in mind that although if you read Pigu himself, he says that that tax revenue can then be given or used to help those who have been harmed by the external effect. But strictly speaking, the imposition of this tax is not designed to compensate or help those who were initially harmed by the externality, by the pollution, for example. The central purpose of the tax is to get the culprit, in this case the firm, to internalize its external costs, so that it's now taking account of those externalities that it's imposing on others, and therefore change its behavior, or all the firms change their behavior such that they are now producing at a socially optimal output. Nothing more than that. Now let's go to positive externalities. For positive externalities of consumption, such as, for example, education, there are a couple of variations on what we would call Pigovian solutions. Pigu says if there's a positive externality, then you should provide a bounty, which today we would translate as a subsidy provided by the government. Now that can take two forms. We can either talk about public provision, where the government produces the optimal quantity of the good using tax revenue, and then may charge a nominal fee to users. The remainder, after it's charged the nominal fee, the remainder is paid for in the form of a subsidy. Or alternatively, you can have a subsidizing of private suppliers, such that the optimal quantity is ultimately produced. So let's look at how these two different approaches, where the government provides the good and maybe charges a nominal fee, versus the government simply subsidizes private suppliers. Now let's look at a case of the government paying a subsidy to a private provider as a way of covering the costs, or partly covering the costs of production. So we've got our private marginal costs of education and our private benefits. We know there are external benefits provided, so we need to add those external benefits on top of the private benefits. That gives us our marginal social benefit curve. This generates for us our theoretical social optimal quantity, which is just the same as before. But the difference is that the supply is by private suppliers. So what we need to do is the private suppliers in a free market would only be willing to offer 0.6 places, 0.6 million places. So how do we get the private suppliers to be willing to supply up to 1.2 million places for students? Well, we can provide a subsidy to the suppliers to increase their supply. Now, the way we're going to increase supply is we're going to represent that by a subsidy that covers, if the suppliers were to produce 1.2 million, their costs would be, marginal costs would be up here at $25 or $25,000 per student. So the government provides them with a subsidy of $15,000 per student, so that their actual supply will be the marginal cost minus the subsidy, so that will push their costs down by the amount of the subsidy, so that they are now able to afford, it's profitable for them now to afford to produce 1.2 million places, as given by this equilibrium here. So this is a private solution, well, a quasi-private solution in the sense that it's private providers, but they are subsidized by the government. What about public goods? Well, in the case of public goods, again, we're really talking about positive externalities. So if a public good is generated, is produced, then there are external benefits for all of those who want to gain access to that good. Because the free market is unlikely to produce the optimal quantity of the public goods, either the public goods have to be produced entirely by the government, or they have to be purchased entirely by the government. So in this case, the government would either function as both the producer and the consumer, or just as kind of like a giant consumer acting on behalf of all of the citizens and purchasing the product from private suppliers. So a rational or allocatively optimizing government will conduct a cost-benefit analysis to determine the optimal quantity. So let's say the government has determined that the marginal social benefits of providing, in this example here, we've got helicopters. So the marginal social benefits of each additional helicopter that's used for rescuing people who've fallen off cliffs or have wandered off into the desert or something like that. And then we've got the marginal social costs of providing the helicopters. The optimal output, the optimal quantity of helicopters for the society as a whole would be, in this case, 3. So we've got the total benefit to the society of the helicopters, of the potential users of the helicopters, and what amounts to, for us, the consumer surplus, or what we can now call the citizen surplus. That is, for the citizens who are going to be using the helicopters, or could potentially use the helicopters, we're going to classify as the net benefit to the society. You can see there it's $2.25 million for the 3 helicopters. Anything beyond that would be socially suboptimal, because we could see it's say 5 helicopters, the marginal cost to the society would be greater than the marginal benefit for that 5th helicopter, and the same for the 4th helicopter. We can see why this can be applicable to all sorts of things. It doesn't have to be helicopters, to national defence. Why don't we have an infinite, or why don't we have, triple the national defence that we have? Well, at some point, the marginal social cost of acquiring yet another jet fighter is going to be greater than the marginal social benefit, the benefit to the society of that next jet fighter. At some point, we want to stop buying jet fighters. We don't need an infinite quantity of them. So we're going to search for some optimal quantity, that is, where the net social benefit is being maximised, or where the marginal social benefits just equal the marginal social cost of the last jet fighter, or whatever it is.